Hey, so last week we looked at series, universes, and trilogies, and what I kind of coined in my own term for a new thing called faux trilogies, which was, from the Spider-Verse, The Matrix, Pirates of the Caribbean, Back to the Future are all examples of this faux trilogy. And so we're going to build upon it this week on our second look at trilogies, which I know should be three-part, but it's only two-part because, that's all I could come up with. And we're going to look at those trilogies, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Hi, I'm Matt, and once a week I usually look at world building techniques, tricks, and tips, but again we are going to look at the second part of trilogies and see how the through line distinguishes them. So my opening caveat is I try not to put any value statements, judgment, and even though I am talking about good, bad, and ugly, much like the world building, I kind of look at if it's really effective or ineffective. And the litmus test for this one is going to be through lines. Through lines, again, being the story, the thing, the spine of the story that holds it all up. And so, the good ones are the ones that have a through line. The bad ones, which aren't really bad, they're really the faux that I invented the term for. And they adhere to a through line, but it's really two through lines. And then the bad are the ones that just muck up the through line altogether. So without further ado, let's start with the good ones, which adhere to a through line. And there are two gold standards. Oddly enough, these two are also my exemplars for world building. Please see book. And those are Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, the first two trilogies of Star Wars at any rate. Lord of the Rings is the granddaddy of trilogies because it was one story that was broken into three because of printing purposes, so it is the definition of the continuous trilogy. Story starts with some flashbacks and stuff and the history of hobbits, but it starts and then continues till the story is over. Pretty much back to back. The through line of it is that it is defeating Sauron by destroying the ring and ushering in the Age of Man. That is the main plot of the story, the thrust of it. You take that out, then it's just a bunch of storylines. The other through lines in the most basic sense, Aragorn becoming king, or Aragorn becoming king, Gollum and Frodo and their interaction, Gimli and Legolas becoming friends, but really those aren't the spine of the story. The spine of the story is defeating Sauron and by destroying the ring. So the others are just more subplots. The prime mover is the through line itself. Now, the original Star Wars trilogy is punctuated, and it is three standalone stories that have one through line throughout it. So, a story, years between, new story, time between, new story, punctuated. So, boom, you're getting some events, but there's still an arc, a through line that holds them all together. And the through line of that was the fall of the Empire, the rise of the rebellion, fall of the Empire, and of which part of it, in it, a subplot is Luke becoming a Jedi. We'll return to that in a little bit. But yeah, there is still a through line of the Empire and the battle of the rebellion against the Empire. Empire wins. In the second one, there are events that, getting Han back and that kind of thing are, carrying over from it, but really it's not a continuation. It's not stuck together like a faux trilogy would be. All right, then there are the Star Wars prequels, which I have done another video about how you can't sword harder or wand harder or lightsaber harder. And so I've looked at this a little bit. I do think they are inferior to the original trilogy, but I was also raised on that one. But the prequels, they still do adhere to a through line. And it is another punctuated trilogy. The through line being the fall of Anakin Skywalker, I guess the rise and fall of Anakin Skywalker and the Jedis, if you want to be more specific. It's not as strong to me because it's centered on pretty much one character, but again, it could just be that I'm old and I bonded to the original, and so anything after that which isn't quite true because I enjoy The Mandalorian, I enjoy exploring the universe, I've always loved the comics and the additional stories in it, but yeah, we're looking at just the movies right now. And it's kind of interesting when you added the prequels to it because it changed the through line of the story entirely. So the first story was Rise of the Rebellion, no, not Rise of the Rebellion, the Rebellion defeating the Empire, the fall of the Empire. But when you add the another three on top of it, it becomes the rise and fall of Anakin Skywalker and final redemption. So, I guess the Empire could kind of be a part of that too, though anyways, it just changes it, makes the Jedi much more important to the through line than it was originally of just Luke becomes a Jedi off screen. Like, very different. Side note to all of this, and this is something I was thinking of yesterday when I was walking the dog, I think also one of the reasons that I don't enjoy the prequel as much is because the group dynamics were off. And this is still playing this out, but in the original trilogy, you have kind of an RPG perfection of all the characters. You have your paladin / cleric and Luke. You have your rogue, that's Han. You have your barbarian and Chewie. You have your mage kind of in R2-D2. He's able to just move things around and do whatever the plot requires him of the minute. And you even have a bard in C-3PO. I haven't really figured out where Leia fits into this, but you see a group dynamic, and it is everything. There's one of everything, and that leads to conflict between them, as we've discussed earlier, in interpersonal conflict, and that really works out well. In the prequel trilogy, it kind of screws with dynamic because all the main characters are basically Jedi. And so you just have a city of paladins and a story of just paladins, and again, Padme is in it, and R2-D2. So, it's a little bit, but it's all focused on just one kind of character class instead of having all the different character classes and a lot more group dynamics. And so I don't think it really supports the story as well because of that, but that is a developing theory that we're looking at. And you'll note about the Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, both of the first two trilogies, is that they have the same bad guy throughout. And I think this has to do with the through line is, defeating the Empire, defeating Sauron, what we're overcoming. So it's not so much the bad guy per se, but it is what we're overcoming. And this brings us to Nolan's Batman, which I almost didn't include on this because I sort of forgot about it, but it is a punctuated trilogy, and it has a through line of the evolution of Batman himself, a good beginning, middle, and end. Specifically those parts, punctuated, through line between them. It is held together more thematically, I think, than, there's always a villain du jour per episode, or per thing, but there is still Batman trying to overcome crime and what he is doing to be a part of it. So there is still that thematic through line throughout it, and it's supported by it. The lack of a continual through line is why I don't think the Raimi's version of Spider-Man really counts. I think or Iron Man or Men in Black, I think those are more series, much like Indiana Jones was, where it's each standalone story. Some characters reoccur, but it's not really a trilogy because there's no through line throughout it. And also, side note, I haven't seen Guardians of the Galaxy yet, which I understand could be a good trilogy. Sorry, I'm a bad nerd, but young child. So now let's return to the bad / faux trilogies. And to review real quick, it's just basically a faux trilogy is one standalone story, a break in time between it for the characters, and then one story that is divided in half, told back to back, and we call that a trilogy. And it's got a cliffhanger in the middle of that second thing. And standalone story, punctuated stuff. I should probably have a infographic made about this. So Back to the Future is the granddaddy of all these faux trilogies, in that it was a standalone story with a little stinger joke at the end of Back to the Future, and but it was meant to be a standalone story. They filmed it as one story with a joke at the end, and left it. And then several years went by, and people are like, "Yeah, where's that other story? Here's more money. It's this huge hit." And then they were like, "Well, let's make some more money off of it." And then they decided to do 2 more movies, and they filmed them back to back, and they released them as one kind of continual story. Boom, you had your midpoint of like, we have to go back. And it's, and the same story is for Pirates and the Matrix. One story, break for the character, one long story told in the form of 2 movies. You'll see the same thing in Spider-Verse, probably. I haven't gotten to see it yet because it's not out all the way. Anyways, yeah. So same thing will probably happen for Spider-Verse. I should also note that Pirates and Matrix were both these, and they have since go on to be series with a 4th movie, again punctuated 4th movies after that, sometimes with different characters. In these, there are 2 through lines. The first through line and then a second through line. And we'll note that also by the bad guys. One bad guy in the first movie, Agent Smith or Barbossa in Pirates. Back to the Future doesn't really have a bad guy, I guess the bullies. And then the second movie usually introduces a new bad guy or some type of thing. I know Agent Smith continues throughout it, but then they bring in the guy at the end in the room with the blinker, and it's a shift in bad guys and goals. In Pirates, it was Barbossa, and then I forgot what his name, Tentacle Guy, and the second one, and in fact Barbossa shows up again to help defend Tentacle Guy. We've had a shift in bad guys opposed to Sauron, the whole time, or the Empire. So shift in bad guys It's a good signifier that there is a shift in the through line. And I think that the shifting the villains actually diminishes the through line, because we started a story, one story, and then we changed it. So it's kind of not a bait and switch, but you're like, oh no, this is a different story. It's the different bad guys. So I think that kind of diminishes the faux, personally speaking. And I think the reason that they did this, though, is because they were unexpected hits, as I mentioned. And like, oh, like Pirates took off like no one expected. Same with The Matrix. They were standalone stories that, let's expand on it, which I am a huge fan of expanding on things, especially when the world building is great and you've already got the world building capital there. Go for it. But it is interesting of why tell two stories instead of story, 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 and continue the world. Like, why this need to try to make it, retrofit, reverse engineer a trilogy when you could just tell separate stories. Yeah, that's just wondered about that myself. I think the new Spider-Man is kind of in a weird space. I'm sorry, this Tom Holland Spider-Man, it's iffy because there are two consecutive stories being told, as in the reveal, the kind of cliffhanger in the post-trailer credit or post-credits. And then it goes right immediately into the third movie. But I would actually say those are kind of standalone stories. The reveal is like so minor that it's after the credits, so it is like its own story. And then they're taking over events here, but anyways, it's its own story, personally speaking. So it feels more like Empire, and moving into Jedi's, and like they spend the first act taking care of the thing that was the problem in the second movie. Anyways, neither here nor there. All right, now we're moving into the ugly trilogies. And again, it's not entirely quality, it's making judgment values here, but usually they're, not that great. And I think this is because they do not adhere to the through line. First one of our ugly ones is The Hunger Games. And even though it's 4 movies, because it should have been 3, but they split that last movie into 4, and they did it in the faux trilogy style of the cliffhanger, everything looks long. And this is historically because of Harry Potter. The last movie of Harry Potter was broken into 2, and which is funny because it was actually, word count-wise, 20% shorter than Order of the Phoenix, which was somehow able to be turned into 1 movie, but, so anyways, it kind of worked for Harry Potter to me, but it definitely did not work for Hunger Games. And I think that's because Hunger Games was not very long. I feel, look at this wonderful picture, like each of the books was the same length, and the first Hunger Games was a great movie and was made off of that, fit really well into the movie. Second one was still pretty good, and then the third one was just, I don't know, it was padded. It was padded because they did not have enough story. And so, anyways, so the padding led to a bad story, and I have to say the third movie, I've seen it more than once, but I don't remember anything except like black slime, and I think that's it. I will give credit to The Hunger Games at least having a consistent bad guy in Snow, I want to say. Anyways, so one consistent bad guy that they keep wanting to defeat the whole time. Second entry into the ugly ones is The Hobbit, and again, it's because of the padding. This is the shortest one of the books. It's shorter than any of the Lord of the Rings books, which were turned into, albeit long movies, but very effectively turned into a movie apiece. But they took this book that was, let me look at the actual word counts of it. It is half the length of Fellowship of the Rings and 2/3 the length of Return of the King, which was a 3-hour movie. Still, they decided to take this book, which was again also the same length of The Hunger Games, and split it into 3 movies. And so because of it, it was padded. They added so many subplots, and it was just nonsensical to me. And that's because of all the padding. Others have made videos of why it's terrible, and I would look at that. And also, I don't want to watch it again, so I don't want to review it. But one of the interesting things that The Hobbit doesn't have is a through line. I mean, there's defeating Smaug, but Smaug gets defeated at like the first 30 minutes of the last movie, so not really the good big bad. They're going on adventure, and that's kind of the thing. The Hobbit was originally meant as adventure stories. I think it was supposed to be he tells an adventure of one of Bilbo's adventures each night to his kid. That's how The Hobbit got written down originally, was he was telling his kid's story. His kid was like, last time you said the door was blue and this time it's red. And he was like, oh, that damn kid. And this is a real story, by the way, of how Tolkien did it. His son told it. And so he started writing down the adventures of the Hobbit. And so that's what The Hobbit was a collection of kind of short stories of an adventure that the parent could read to child, one adventure per night. And so it's held together as a through line of adventures, but there's not one overarching story other than adventures. So it's really more of a series that was really a standalone story and should have been a standalone story, but they tried to shoehorn it with a through line of defeating Smaug, but again, all those subplots, Smaug's defeated early, like it just didn't work. And why did they do that? Well, because it had worked for the Hunger Games and for Harry Potter, so they're like, hey, money. Which is interesting too, because Peter Jackson was one of the exemplars. He got Lord of the Rings made. He got nerd high fantasy to be a thing since the first time since the 80s, and that was great. And it was an act of love. And then you see The Hobbit, and it is just pure money grab. And I think that's one of the things that makes the cynicism of it comes through because of the padding and all of that other stuff. The last entry in our terrible, ugly ones is the third trilogy of Star Wars, and it is egregiously bad. It is so egregiously bad that they had dozens of Star Wars movies planned, but the third one in the trilogy came out and it did so poorly that they stopped making Star Wars movies for many years. They've gone on to make The Mandalorian and a whole bunch of really great series like Andor and Boba Fett, but anyways, but they stopped making movies, Star Wars movies, and that's huge because think about how much they paid to make Star Wars movies and how many they had planned. This trilogy was that bad that it destroyed that. And I have my own issues with J.J. Abrams. I actually, years ago, said that he was an AI program, and after watching Chatbot and all these really things, I really stand by it. But it would have been better if he had guided the whole trilogy. Instead, he gave it to the other director whose name I am blanking on, who did Brick, which I love as a film, and the Glass Onion, which is not so great. But anyways, and by just giving it to him, I don't think they actually had a plan. And that new director with Last of the Jedi just kind of like pooped all over everything, and like, oh no, you're not just kind of threw out and tried to upend and subvert a lot of the things that we thought about Jedis and stuff, and in the end it didn't work. And so when J.J. Abrams came back in the third movie after everyone hated the second movie, he was like, well, I don't really know how to do that, we're just going to undo everything that you did last time, and also somehow Palpatine returned. And that's kind of the sense of schizophrenia that was to these by having different directors. The original trilogy had different directors, and but Lucas oversaw it all, and it kind of worked. And they did make things up on the fly, but they all worked together, opposed to the new trilogy, and that didn't really have a through line. And I will point out, because it shifted villains throughout. There was Snoke, I don't remember who the first villain was, and then it was Snoke, but he's defeated in the second one, and then somehow Palpatine returned because we need a new villain, and he's scary, you guys hate him already, right? And so, Kylo Ren, you could argue, was a villain, but he really was kind of redeemed at the end, but was he really? And I don't quite remember it, even though I've watched it twice, because it's also nonsensical. So yeah, this broke the through line, and that's why I think it gave that schizophrenic sense. And it also broke the through line of the series itself, because remember, original trilogy, Fall of the Empire, then kind of like the rise and fall of Anakin and the in the Empire, and then it's like the rise of the new Empire, but also the fall of it. And there's Skywalker and Palpatine bloodlines, and they're at war because the Jedi, but they're gone now, and it just doesn't make sense anymore. There is no through line through it. It's just a mess. And so, like The Hobbit, the most recent trilogy, Star Wars trilogy, sullied these gold standards of trilogies themselves because they were also money grabs and done by people who were more interested in the money. This is something I've said about Abrams for a while, than actually understanding and caring for the material. It was not a labor of love. So yeah, there you go. This is some things to consider for your own stories when you're working them into a series, a trilogy, or standalones. We invent worlds to tell stories. And when you have that world, you want to go back to it, and and that is great. Like, if you have a world that is so cool and vibrant that you want to tell more stories, you should definitely do that. But if you're going to expand on your standalones, you should study these trilogies, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the faux, and see how you want to go about it. Do you want to make a trilogy? Do you need to start that off from the very beginning if that's the goal? Or do you want to add a series? Or do you want to make a faux trilogy? It's great. And if you make a trilogy, just know the rules so you can break them if you want to. Hope you enjoyed that, and I hope it can help you build some better worlds and tell some better stories.